Cars racing full throttle. A typical race, it seems. Until you realize there, right there next to the track, is a car burning, with a driver stuck underneath, fighting for his life.
You know, I never knew that Williams was sitting in there.
Why? What happened? Is he gonna survive? Well, I hope you're ready, because it's one hell of a fucking story. This is the most disgraceful day in our beloved sports history. Let's go back to the 70s, the era of some of the most legendary drivers, crazy designs, and not to forget some of the most epic races we've ever witnessed. But hey, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It was also the most dangerous decade in F1 history. With it came drama, crazy crashes, insane rivalries, and a whole lot of risk for a taste of glory. Every Grand Prix, the limits were being pushed, and sometimes too far. The cars had gotten way faster compared to the 50s and 60s. Teams started going all in on engines, materials, and aerodynamics, leaving those old tin cars in the dust. Back then, there was a lot of technical freedom, definitely way more than we got now. Regulations in aerodynamics, chassis, or suspension were wide open. So engineers started coming up with all sorts of crazy ideas to try and be the quickest on track. Just to give you an idea, in that same decade, there were cars as crazy as the non-wings Arrows A2, the Brabham BT46B fan car, the March 711 with whatever that front wing was, the six-wheeled Tyrrell P34, or the Ligier JS5, aka the Teapot. Honestly, I could go on all day naming insane cars like these, but the point being, all of this freedom to innovate gave fresh teams like McLaren, Williams, or Tyrrell the chance to step up, turning into a contest of who could come up with the wildest, most out-of-the-box ideas to make their cars faster. And fucking hell did it work. The downside? Well, let's just say safety and reliability were pretty much afterthoughts.
Those were tragic times in so many ways because we lost some icons of our sport.
However, most of us would still consider this the golden era of F1. It felt like innovation and adrenaline at its absolute peak. And back then, with a bit of cash and a good engineer, almost anyone could buy an F1 car and start racing. There are so many stories from this era, and unfortunately, today's story is one that most people in the sport would rather forget about. One of the many doomsdays of the 70s, one that should have never happened. Welcome to the 1973 season. After Fittipaldi and Lotus snagged both titles in 1972, they were up against Stewart and Tyrrell, who were hungry for revenge after missing out the year before. This was shaping up to be a seriously intense season. Back then, the competition was all about the Ford Cosworth engines, who were already pushing 470 horsepower. Meanwhile, Ferrari just couldn't seem to make it work. This was also the season they brought in the warm-up lap. Before that, they just had what they called a dummy grid. Basically, a little space behind the actual grid where the cars would roll from to start the race. No tire warming or anything. Also, it was the year that we saw what could kind of be called a safety car for the first time at the Canadian GP, though the real deal wouldn't show up until 20 years later. Oh, and on the track side, we got the first ever Brazilian GP at Interlagos and the Swedish GP at Anderstorp. But one of the biggest talking points of the season was the return of the Dutch GP at Zandvoort. Why, you ask? Well, after 14 years of running non-stop, it was supposed to be on the 72 calendar, but the drivers straight up refused to race there that year. Why?
For me, it was a very simple black and white case. You know, we either get the racetracks themselves to recognise they needed to do more, had to put more fencing up or more barriers up. It was all costing money, and they had never had to spend the money.
The track's facilities and conditions were so outdated, they considered it to be too dangerous. Something you wouldn't really ever hear back then.
Just want to make sure that if we practice and the surface is breaking up, the race will be cancelled, because we don't want any more that they will repair the road for the fourth time or the third time.
And tragedy had already struck in 1970 when Pierce Courage, driving for Frank Williams, had a massive crash at the Tunnel Oost corner. A wheel came off and hit him in the head, causing him to tragically pass away.
The Grand Prix Drivers Association had a really good articulated vehicle with everything on board. The people did not put him into that vehicle.
They took him to the wrong hospital. And the time he got to the right hospital, he died.
In the name of the Father.
It was a total disaster, and drivers like Stewart even called Zandvoort evil. But luckily, the pressure from skipping the next year ended up working. A group of enthusiasts stepped up and saved it by dumping nearly $1 million, in today's money, into fixing it up. Big changes were made, like putting in Armco barriers to keep the track away from the sand dunes. They also added new pits and threw in a chicane before Bossout, which was the crazy fast corner that went straight into the pits, just to slow the cars down a bit. The new changes made the gravel traps wider in a few places, but honestly, most of the track received barely any changes at all.
Now this is very unfortunate, and I have the total sympathy for the organisers, for the club, and to some extent for the track owners. They've tried very hard.
But the real question was, would all of this be enough to stop tragedies from happening? Unfortunately, you already know the answer. F1 rolled into Zandvoort in 1973 with the championship tighter than ever. Stewart was in the lead, but only by a single point over Fittipaldi. So with 6 races left, it was still anyone's game. And don't forget about Francois Savag, who was right on their heels, just 8 points behind Fittipaldi. He wasn't that close, but he still had a serious shot. Also, 25-year-old Roger Williamson made his debut at Silverstone with March. The guy had just won the British Formula 3 titles in 71 and 72, and there were high hopes for him going into his second race. During his debut, an 11-car crash took him out, one of the scariest wrecks I've ever seen. But somehow, no one got hurt, and Williamson wasn't scared at all. He was dead set on making a name for himself in F1. It was absolutely pouring on Friday during practice, and visibility was basically non-existent. Not exactly the best conditions to test out the new track. Luckily, the weather cleared up on Saturday, and qualifying went down without any issues. Peterson grabbed pole ahead of Stewart with Savag in third. Fittipaldi ended up 6th, but ended up crashing and switching cars, dropping him to P16 because of a penalty. He was gonna have to do some serious catching up if he didn't want to fall too far behind in the championship. The stage was set. If only we would have known the disaster that was about to unfold. The 29th of July 1973. After a year off, the 70,000 fans are cheering in the stands. I mean, who wouldn't be? They've worked hard to bring the Grand Prix back, and now it's time to enjoy. Right off the bat, the big names are moving up together while the first retirements kick in. It's the 70s. What did you expect? Back then, there were constant retirements for any and all reasons, but the craziest one? Fittipaldi had to pull out on lap 2 because the injuries from the crash on Saturday were too much. Yeah, you heard me right. He apparently couldn't push the brake pedal hard enough. Other than that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. A beautiful race in a beautiful country. Until... No fucking way. Seeing this horrific scene, David Purley, Williamson's teammate, immediately stops and jumps out of his car. But for some reason, the race just keeps going like nothing's wrong, with cars flying past the scene at full speed. And the seconds keep ticking by. Purley, putting himself in danger, tries to flip the car over while he hears Williamson screaming and choking. But the flames make it impossible to do, well, anything. The marshals, they don't even have the right gear to help. They don't even have fire extinguishers, for God's sake. Nearly a full agonizing minute after the crash, the yellow flag is finally waved. Yeah, yellow. Purley, desperate, crosses the track to grab a fire extinguisher, but still, no one else steps in to help. After trying everything, with no success, Purley's body language says it all. The seconds drag on into minutes, and still, no one does a single thing. Honestly, no words. All he can do now is wave at other cars to slow down. Why is no one doing anything? Why is the race still going? On lap 20, 12 laps after the crash, about 15 minutes later, a fire truck finally heads to the scene.
Why do you think it took the fire engine so long to get here?
But sadly, it's way too late. Williamson had been stuck inside the car all this time and most likely passed away just a few minutes after the crash, his life taken by the toxic fumes of the fire.
He was a very good friend of mine. May he rest in peace.
Stewart won the race, but after what had happened, there was barely any celebration.
Williamson's dead. There's no lap of honour. Quiet presentation.
Just serious faces all around. This is one of the most heartbreaking and mind-boggling accidents in F1 history.
It's clear that in racing, we are all the same. In life, you need just some extra luck.
And I can't even imagine the pain Williamson went through, or how Purley must have felt trying everything to save his teammate. So what the hell happened? Why did no one help? The race director Ben Houseman later said he didn't have radio contact with that corner and thought the smoke was from tires burning by the spectators.
De enige informatie die u had was visueel. Ik zie een heleboel rook.
Ja. En jongens, zien jullie verder wat? Is er wat aan de hand? Nee.
And there was just a big pool of smoke came up the other side of the track. So because of the other side of the track, and there wasn't a TV screen to see or anything, you didn't know what had happened. You knew there had been a crash.
Honestly, I'm not sure if I buy these stories, but what's clear is that neither the track nor F1 were ready for something like this back then.
What are your feelings about this today?
I can see now why a lot of people wouldn't come and help me. But I think that we could have, done something else. We could have done something more for Roger.
And as usual in F1, only after a tragic and simply unforgivable tragedy like this did the FIA make reglementary changes to the on-track rescue equipment.
It was a bad period of motorsport. But as time went on, they suddenly realized they had to do something.
They made sure marshals had proper fire suits, helmets, and everything else they needed. The shame is so intense, the sport had no choice to put investments into safety improvements. And how Williamson's accident was handled is something that should have never happened. Not ever.
Why did it take 8 minutes for one of those tenders to get to the scene of the fire?
That's a very easy answer. It was already too late to save the man's life.
It honestly breaks my heart. I know this story doesn't have a very happy ending, so if you want to get your mood up, make sure to watch this one next. And as always, thank you for watching.